Hi, with Julian on the brown note on a very wayward bank holiday Monday, where I've been trying to film some album reviews for hours of building work, getting drunker and drunker. I've got 3 pages of notes for this. This could go on for some time. A perfect 10, a series I've done on albums I think are worth 10 out of 10, and one that's a very personal choice for me, which is the Flaming Lips Soft Bulletin. I featured it on the radio recently as it celebrated its 25th anniversary about 7 days ago now. The iconic band became not just darlings of the underground in the alternative music arena of America, but up there with, at that time, where Radiohead were. They sort of completely leapt ahead of a lot of their peers. I think that era is really interesting. I've said it in other reviews where everything that was happening in sort of like 1990 to 1995 sort of era was very scene based. And a lot of the acts that emerged after sort of 1995 were very individualistic. They weren't really part of a scene. I think that happened in the 80s a bit because like bands like The Cure and Depeche Mode and New Order and the Smiths, they might have engendered scenes, but they were pretty isolated on their own, in their own lane. And I think the Flaming Lips were as well. The album's often praised for its kaleidoscope of sound, which is sometimes mentioned in the same breath as Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. But what it never gets is credit for being one of the most lyrically and thematically strong albums of the entire genre of alternative music. It just never gets the credit. It's got this background theme which I think has grown stronger over the years of, you know, we open with scientists being heroes, and there's this whole notion of heroes putting their lives on the line, yet in the background this existential dread and anxiety, which I think is more relevant today than when the album was released. And people just don't pay attention to the lyrics on this album. I really like this idea of, you know, at the end, towards the end of the album, of Superman not being able to lift a weight. Like, metaphorically, this album is so strong and doesn't get credit. The whole notion of, you know, scientists and, am I going to get a sun now? And of depression and of anxiety and of an inability to meet the goal. And also Wayne Coyne's singing on this album is superb. His voice is never been regarded as a strong element to the band's sound, I don't think, and I think that's unfair. Here he sings some of the most beautiful melodies the Flaming Lips have made, and his voice cracks and warbles in a way that enhances them. The other side of the album is the production of David Friedman from Mercury Rev, and I feel like his production, this very fat sound that he would become synonymous with all the way up to like 5 or 6 years later with the likes of MGMT, was one of the defining sounds of alternative music from that era. Particularly this really sort of fat bass sound, which sounded otherworldly, and his own band sort of started tapping into the orchestral, Pet Soundsy, wide-ranging sound of the Soft Bulletin with their own album Deserter songs previously. But I kind of feel like I did a Gone But Forgotten review on Gran Turismo by the Cardigans, I think a incredibly underrated album, which has this really fat soundstage, particularly when it comes to bass. And I think that's another element here that's superb and deserves singling out. And it's also one of the great 1-2s in alt-rock, with the Soft Bulletin and Yoshimi Battles the Pink Robots, another masterpiece. There are plenty of people who will tell you that Yoshimi is a better album. I've just got the sun right in my eyes. I don't agree for one reason only, and that is because I think that Yoshimi's thematically coherent but about less important things. So there's a lot of sort of Japanese culture and kung fu and that side of stuff. It's a more fun album. And, you know, sci-fi and outer space, whereas this is a lot more serious an album, I feel. And I think it stands alongside, you know, the great 1-2s in alt-rock history, Surfer Rosa and Doolittle from the Pixies, Nevermind and In Utero from Nirvana, Lonesome Crowded West, and Moon and Antarctica from Modest Mouse, and also one of the great albums thematically of the alternate rock era, alongside, say, Neutral Milk Hotels, In the Aeroplane, I See a Darkness from Will Oldham. The Moon and Antarctica itself had this incredible sort of existential, universal look at the whole of existence, often involving the cosmos, which I thought was hugely strong. And one that really stands out, which is a sister album of this, is OK Computer by Radiohead. And that's not just because that set the benchmark for these hugely ambitious sonic experimental albums with very strong songwriting, but because the opening song on OK Computer, did I turn that on? Yes. The opening song, Airbag, from OK Computer is, in an interstellar burst back to save the universe, has that whole superhero thing, as well as melding, the anxiety of the modern world into a thematically coherent piece. I feel like these are sister albums, really. And I will say this, I'm reviewing the English or UK and Australian version of the CD because it's superior to the American version. It really does trouble me that for the last 25 years, the American version of this album has the watered down version of Race for the Prize as its opener. I mean, not having that incredible crunch of drums blasting through the speakers in the opening seconds. It's like, why would you do that? Because the record company wanted them to have some more commercial sounding songs on the album. So you get rid of arguably the standout and replace it with a tepid remix. And I'm not, I don't think the Spider Bite song or Bugging are in any way superior to what's on the UK version. So that's the one I'm going with. The album thunders out of the gate with Race for the Prize, one of the most ebullient, life-affirming alt-rock songs of all time. It's euphoric. The drums just crash like waves. It's incredible. The melodies are divine. The lyrics and the vocal performance are incredibly heartfelt. And it sets a tone, that I feel's more relevant. Like, I've got a lot of lyrics on this album to get through. I hope you have been to the toilet before engaging on this journey. Two scientists are racing for the good of all mankind, both of them side by side, so determined, locked in heated battle for the cure that is their prize. But it's so dangerous, but they're determined. Theirs is to win. If it kills them, they're just humans with wives and children. It's just such an incredible lyric to this song, particularly the way that chorus hits, where it's just like, they're just humans with wives and children. But also because in the modern era, we have done the most disgusting and despicable thing that we could have, which is half the world regards scientists as being our biggest enemy. Which is, there have been enemies to science throughout human history, usually from religion, but the modern era's opposition to science as a thing, I mean, even on climate change posts, is truly depressing. Are we that more advanced than people in the Middle Ages? Doesn't look like half of us are. But, in the post-COVID era, two scientists racing for the good of all mankind it hits harder. And I also remember there was this cartoon, it might have been a French cartoon that came out probably around the same time. And it was a movie-length cartoon about a race around the world. and it had these, I think, like a cheetah and a lion or something holding hands. If anyone remembers that, you're going to know what I'm talking about. But it just kind of gives me that imagery. And there's also fatalism at the heart of the lyrics on this album. They're not like, it takes a very optimistic track in the opening, but it doesn't stay there. It allows a certain fatalism, like the end of the song, forging for the future, but to sacrifice their lives, both of them side by side, so determined. The album gets a bit more bleak and depressing as it goes on. People talk about stuff like dubstep having the best bass drops. Nothing at all in dubstep has a bass drop like A Spoonful Weighs a Ton. I remember buying the CD of this album and sitting on my coffee table and putting it in my NAD CD player, quality CD player, that, and race for the prize. I'd never heard any Flaming Lips music. I got it like the week it came out in Islington in London, because everyone was raving about it. I was like, what the hell is this? And just remember sitting through the first song, and then this second one started with, again, a lyric that is invoking heroism at cost. And though they were sad, they rescued everyone. They lifted up the sun. And there's a coherence between weight, which appears later in the album as well. The doubters all were stunned, heard louder than a gun, the sound they made was love. Like, there is this very open-hearted optimism to some of the lyrics, and then this very sort of resigned fatalism to others. That sun better not be blasting everything out. But when the bass drop hits, the whole soundstage is just like whoosh. It's one of the great bass drops in any form of music. It's amazing. And David Friedman's style, using that full sound of the bass, I feel is absolutely epic. If I sit back out of it, I've probably got a few more minutes. The third song is probably the centerpiece of the album, which is The Spark That Bled. I accidentally touched my head and noticed that I had been bleeding. For how long I didn't know. What was this I thought that struck me? What weapon have they got? The softest bullet ever shot. And then the emphatic declaration of I stood up and I said yeah, which is one of the multi-part songs on the album, which goes through many sonic stages. They really did throw the kitchen sink into this album by not just using a soundstage that's very dramatic and interesting, but changing it continually through the songs. This time around we shift from the global perspective of the narrative of these heroes out there fighting for us to the very much more intimate first person. And it's a more groove-based song as well. And it does go into multiple stages. I think it's the longest track on the album. A brilliant track. The slow motion track, which isn't one of the strongest, it might be one of the weaker ones on the album, which is still stronger, I think, than the American tracks that are included, is still a beautiful track. I don't think that the lyrics on this one are interesting, but it's got this kind of Beach Boys via Bex Odelay sort of vibe to it, which I thought was really cool. And you know, it would have been a standout on another album, but it's probably one of the less tracks here. What Is the Light? Another absolute standout and potential centerpiece. Really dramatic, the way that it's an album that feels like it, if you described it to someone, that it's overstuffed, but there's a lot of minimalism in the way that they use orchestration and multiple instruments on the tracks. They're not there all the way through. I'm sitting back because I'm just being blasted by sunlight, so I'm assuming that it's going to come out on the camera. It's got this really dramatic heartbeat pulse that goes through it with just like chords from pianos. Very, very excellent. what is the light that you have, and this again going to the second person, what is the light that you have shining around you? Is it chemically derived? Because if it's natural, something glowing from inside you, shining all around you, the potential has arrived. It's got such a soaring melody to it as well. And when that song ends, it carries on that beat through the next song, which is The Observer, which is an instrumental palette cleanser halfway through the album. The most sort of dark side of the moon of the album, one of the instrumental passages from Dark Side of the Moon, and a very sort of sci-fi sort of thing. It's a lovely pacing break from some pretty intense emotional songs that preceded it. And then especially as you drop off into the most beautiful song on the whole album, Waiting for Superman, which is just magnificent. It really does tie in a lot of the themes of being a hero but being unable to act. The lyrics, is it getting heavy? Well, I thought it was already as heavy as it can be. Is it overwhelming to use a crane to crush a fly? And then the chorus, tell everybody waiting for Superman that they should try to hold on as best they can. He hasn't dropped them, forgot them, or anything. It's just too heavy for Superman to lift. And I really found that motive about the previous Lifting Up the Sun motive from the A Spoonful Weighs a Ton track, and the idea that Superman's, got his head in his hands and he can't save us, it's too heavy. I really found that quite powerful, but it's also got the most beautiful barroom piano melody of any track on the album. The piano on it is just absolutely wonderful. It's got this half-time drum tattoo, The Sun's Out of My Eyes. The vocal melody, which is aped by the piano, is divine. And when it comes to it's quite a long verse chorus scenario, which only really resolves itself in full twice. But the second time, Is It Getting Heavy, comes around, is the emotional high point of the album, where this trumpet fanfare comes in. It's so emotionally overpowering, it's beautiful. And really, as a 1-2 on the album, I love the fact that it goes from that global, universal superhero motive to the most mundane personal story on the album, which is something has changed. Suddenly everything has changed, which is probably the most dynamically changing composition on the album. It's an incredible track, and it refocuses from Superman down to the individual doing very mundane things, putting all the vegetables away that you bought from the grocery store today, and it goes fast. You think of the past, and suddenly everything has changed. It's got the wildest arrangements, and each take on those verses, each of the 3 verses, has a completely different sonic arrangement. It's quite ridiculous that they went to those lengths, but it gives the impression of traveling through a very mundane day, and I really love that. Putting all the clothes you washed away, as you're folding up the shirts you hesitate. And I really felt the whole existential weight of the modern era in that lyric. I thought it was an incredible moment. Track 9, The Gash, is again probably a more mundane than those 2 absolute standouts. It's got a bit of a polyphonic spree feel with the choral vocals and the very pessimistic lyrics on this song. Actually, as the album moves into its last phases, it's almost like the hope of Race for the Prize is kind of admitting defeat, not giving up, but just sort of admitting that they failed. Is that gash in your leg really why you've stopped? Because I've noticed all the others, though they're gashed, they're still going. Because I feel the reason you're quitting and admitting that you've lost all the will to battle on. Will the fight for our sanity be the fight for our lives? But the thought that went unspoken was understanding that you're broken, still a last volunteer battles on. It's almost like admonishing the person that hasn't fought to the end. It's a pretty deep and probably sonically not the high point. And then we get one last absolutely top tier song, which is Feeling Yourself Disintegrate. Almost like a most Radiohead moment on there. It continues the same sort of melancholic tone and depressed vibe of the previous track. It's got a gorgeous chorus. It's got a kind of warm bath death vibe to it, sort of sinking into it. Love in our life is just too valuable to feel for even a second without it, but life without death is just impossible. To realize something is ending within us. Feeling Yourself Disintegrate is pretty much the last lyrics on the whole album. It sort of like comes out, for all its, you know, the blind, almost cartoonish optimism of Race for the Prize, it comes out blinking into the reality with a more somber take on everything. And Sleeping on the Roof is just a stark piano ballad. Another vaguely sci-fi instrumental. It's brief, it's like an end of credits. Overall, it's just a masterpiece of an album. It always gets credit for the incredible instrumental variety and songwriting, but perhaps not so much for Wayne's singing, which is at a peak on this album, and also for the lyrics, which are thematically, I feel, even more relevant today. And, you know, when I listen to something like The Moon and Antarctica, and it sort of places the human race in the cosmos, I don't know why it doesn't get more credit. So for me, happy 25th anniversary to the Flaming Lips Soft Bulletin, and a perfect 10 out of 10.